Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of the Merriam-Webster book thing. My name is Ammon Shea, and joining me today is Adam Maid. And we are absolutely beyond delighted to be joined today by none other than Stacey Abrams, the author most recently of this lovely book. Hi, Stacey. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for having me.
I am assuming that you are sufficiently well known to our audience that we can dispense with your biography. Um, and also because what we're interested in here is the conceit of our particular book group is that we want to talk about your book, but we like to focus on the language of the book because we are dictionary writers. We are not literary theorists or critics or anything like that. And so people can ask questions in the chat function of the Zoom, and we will get to as many questions as we can. You can ask any question you want. It doesn't have to be about language per se, but we will kind of structure our conversation somewhat about language. But before we get to that, I would like to say that I just absolutely adored the book. It was really a great read. And so before I say anything else, thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you. It was fun to write.
Yeah, great. It was much fun to read. And one of the things that Adam and I, when we were discussing it as we were reading it, is one of the questions that came up for us first, before anything else, was that you've obviously written in several different genres, which is admirable and incredibly impressive. You've written a number of nonfiction books about politics. This is your first, what we might think of as a genuine thriller. And then you've written as Selena Montgomery a number of books as romance in the romance genre. And what we were talking about is that, obviously there's a difference between the language you use for political nonfiction and then fiction, but what word choices do you make that are peculiar to thriller? Did you consciously adjust your language when shifting from romance to thriller?
So I write romantic suspense, and in that space, because I write more suspense driven than purely romance driven, that's given me more flexibility with the language I use. In romance, you are doing a lot more character development in a very specific way. You are building a relational profile. And so a lot of the language you use is really designed to allow the reader to believe that they either know the characters really well, or if you're really good at it, they feel like they are the characters.
Right. Right.
In While Justice Sleeps and in sort of traditional thriller, sometimes the language is a distancing technique, because you've got to create these multiple universes that are operating both in tandem and in tension. And so my challenge there was really to have characters who were so distinct and have universes that worked together, but again, in this sort of tension that the language really had to think about, okay, if I'm talking to lawyers, what will lawyers sound like? If I'm talking to politicians, what do they sound like? If I'm talking to a biogeneticist, what does that universe sound like? But making sure that you could, if you closed your eyes, you could, and you heard the dialogue, you would know distinct characters from one another. And so I guess the through line is I love language. And even in my romance novels, I have a tendency to use the most complicated language I can without going over,
Right.
because I love words. And I think books, especially genre fiction, is genre writing is an amazing place to try new words out as long as you provide good context. And so that was a very complicated way of saying, yeah, sort of.
Right. Okay. That's great. But one of the things that really struck me was that you really kind of hew to the conventions of this genre. And before we go any further, I'd like to say I love genre fiction, and I'm a fan of many different types of genres, and I think it's every bit as noble an endeavor to write in genre fiction as postmodern or anything else. But I was really impressed by how faithful to the conventions of this genre you were, except there was one section, it was on page 338, and this is not really a spoiler, but your protagonist, the heroine, ends up in the judge's chambers with the judge's son, and there's been some romantic tension between them, but not so much. It's not driving the book and then suddenly they kiss, and you have this line, the kiss stretched beyond time, comma, beyond promise. And I have to say, I felt like you were really doing a romance writer flex there. Like you were, it was such a beautiful line. It's very short, but it's a very poetic use of promise, beyond promise. And it felt like you were just showing that you can kind of switch over into this slightly other alternate dimension there.
Well, so I started writing this book 10 years ago, and I had different friends read it. I don't write my book to my readers in the sense that I'm not going to have someone say, "Oh, I don't like this," and I'm going to change a bunch of things. But readers find different things in stories that you didn't know you were doing. I was very thoughtful about not making this a romance novel. And while there are certainly the romantic capacity or possibilities existed in the story, I did think I was doing a disservice not to acknowledge it, but I wasn't going to make it the whole story. And so sometimes a single line or a couple of lines give you everything that the reader who wanted to see resolution, it gives them the thing they need without it becoming a whole chapter. And so that was my flex.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I did notice I started reading one of your earlier novels, Secrets and Lies, which is a romantic thriller. And because I so loved that line of the kiss stretched beyond time, beyond promise, I was interested how often do you use the word promise? And I looked it up because I got the Kindle version of Secrets and Lies, and you use promise in that a lot. It's 43 times in that book, and I felt like promise is then one of these words that becomes, I don't know if this is a conscious thing, but it feels like it's an indicator of something else, and it's not at all repetitious. It's entirely, all the times I've come across it, it feels very natural. But your use of that particular word, and I don't know, are there words that you've found that you kind of rely on or that you go to that are in that vein, like words that are peculiar to you?
I I would say like many, I may not notice that I do it a lot. And so I can't say that I realized I used it. When you said I use promise a lot in Secrets and Lies, I thought, well, why would I do that? And that's a story because it's a story about trust. And because the story begins with a lot of distrust, everything in that story kind of pivots around how two people who have really no reason to work together and to fall for each other, how they build their relationship. So I would say probably if you looked at other novels, you will find a conceit that was in my head that, unbeknownst to me becomes encapsulated by a word that I use over and over again. So while I'm surprised that I use promise that many times, because I try not to use words too many times in a book, because I don't want to be repetitious, I can imagine that depending on the book, there is a word that I use too much. For example, I think in While Justice Sleeps, there is a word that I used more times than I realized until someone pointed it out. And that word is cunning. It's some variation on the theme.
Right.
And I didn't realize it because it's not a word I use often in my daily parlance, but apparently it became a word I liked.
Right.
Yeah. Would you say that there's any similarity between, I guess the effect that you're trying to have on the reader between romance and mystery? It kind of feels like it's sort of the same muscle. You're kind of constantly keeping people on the edge of their seat, it feels like.
I want readers to want to stay in the world I create. And both through form and language, that's the way you hold them. So, the format is that you want to create a story that, and I completely recognize that I'm ripping off Aristotle, but essentially you want to create a problem that by resolution creates a new problem so that the reader constantly has to stay with the story to find out what else is going to occur. And that's, a nice little cheat to draw them through it. So the form requires it. And then the language requires it. If you get bored with the word choice, even if you care about the story, you're going to put it down. You might come back, you may not. And so for me, whether it's fiction and within fiction, whether it's romance or, I've written a serial killer romance novel, I've written action adventure one, I've written this legal thriller. The language for me is always, I want people to like the writing. I want them to like the words, and I want them to feel smarter, not in a pedantic way or didactic way, but in a, I now know something new, or I've now gotten something else I hadn't expected by traveling through this book, and I want to stay and see what else I can get.
Yeah, I felt through the entire book just a sense of a respect for the audience. Like you respected your reader enough to know that, you know, you could go off on, you know, tangents about scientific and legal things that they might not necessarily understand, but you know that they will catch up. You know that they will be there with you.
So my mom is a research librarian when I was growing up. My mom's now a pastor, a retired minister. But you know, when my mother said, go look it up, it was not an idle threat. and you couldn't say, well, I can't find it, because there was a whole library at your disposal. And what I loved about that was that when I learned something, I would want to share it with my brothers and sisters. And you learn that you could be so fascinated by this topic. But I had an older sister who was 3 years older, and I had younger brothers and sisters. And your job was to make sure everyone listening to your story could understand it. And so you wanted to give enough credence to the older person, but you also wanted to invite the younger people into the conversation. And for me, that's the best kind of writing. When you use language, you don't dumb it down, but you contextualize it, and you contextualize the ideas and the conceits and the objectives in a way that everyone can be a part of it. And so you don't, I always resist the sort of lowest common denominator theory of writing. Like, trust that people will meet you where you are. And if they're not there on their own, give them a map so they can meet you there.
You know, you just reminded me of something earlier when, you know, Amazon, I don't think they do this anymore, but they used to have this nice feature for each book on their site. They would have this thing called statistically improbable sentences, where they would find sentences in a specific work that are unlikely to come up in other contexts. And I have to say that your recent quote of "I fully realize I'm totally ripping off Aristotle" is what we would call a statistically improbable phrase there. So it's very nice, but it's peculiar to you now. But in terms of your growing up in that great learning environment, did you have was there a household dictionary? Do you remember what it was, or what was it?
Oh yes.
We won't be offended. We won't be offended if it's.
It could be Oxford. It could be Cambridge. We don't care.
So the Oxford was actually at the library where my mom worked. We did have Merriam-Webster. And I did actually endeavor as a child to read the entire dictionary. That was my summer. One of my summers was spent reading every word in the dictionary. We had Childcraft encyclopedias and World Book encyclopedias. Like, when I tell you, my parents, when they said go look it up, they meant it. We had it all. But the biggest thing, like my mission when I grew up, was to be able to afford an Oxford English dictionary of my own, and to have that big marble table where it could sit.
Do you have one?
I do not. But now that I've said it out loud, I remind myself that was something I dreamed about for a very long time.
Yeah, it's a great book to have. You'll never be bored with that book in your library. So it's actually 20 books, but you'll never be bored with those 20 volumes in your library. So what dictionary do you use now? And you can say any other one. We don't offend, because we're a dictionary. We're incapable of being offended.
No. So it's Blue, and I've had it for about 20 years. And I'm trying to remember. I'm assuming it's Merriam-Webster.
Do you typically, when you need to go look, do you go online or do you go to paper?
I will go to paper if I'm at home looking for a word, but I do have, and I'm not just saying it because I'm on here with you guys. I do indeed have Merriam-Webster's dictionary on my phone.
All right. Is there a particular word that you find that you are always that you always have to look up? No.
I have a pretty good memory for words, so I'm pretty good at it.
One of the things that was also, I thought, kind of striking about this particular book, the book we're talking about, While Justice Sleeps, is the way that you were able to jump from jargon to jargon, or from one thing to another. And what was kind of refreshing was that occasionally you would have characters speak in the jargon of their field, it almost reminded me of this great opening line. I'm going to butcher the line, but in Homage to Catalonia, the beginning, George Orwell talks about how in the Spanish Civil War sometimes it seems more like it was a war more of initialisms than of ideologies, because there was the NPRG or the PRG and the NKVD, and at certain points you have characters talking about these agencies or initialisms, and you don't need to explain what it is, because it would, to my line of thinking, it would slow down the narrative. And other points, you do make it clear where it seems germane or appropriate. And it was nice to feel like, as a reader, you didn't need to hold our hands the whole way. And so it was very refreshing.
Well, thank you. I mean, as someone who has worked in government and more specifically as a bureaucrat, I think there's a necessity to be authentic in how those conversations would happen. So when it's Betty Papaleo, like, of course, she's going to talk about things in acronyms because that's how she thinks, that's how she works. Right. But when it's, when it's either new to the characters or when the reader doesn't need to know, if the reader doesn't need to know it, it doesn't need to be in the story. But I'm always trying to make sure that the language you're going to need to understand later on, give it to you early enough so that when I reference it again, it doesn't feel brand new. Right. And I may not explain it the first time I say it, but I want to just lay the breadcrumbs, or at least give you the baseline so that when this new idea comes into being and actually matters at this moment, that you don't feel jarred and shoved into this world that you weren't expecting to be in. Because right. I find, especially in genre fiction, when either the writer wants you to be there with him or her already, they'll dump you in, and you sometimes feel like you're drowning in new information without having either a life preserver or learning to swim, or they think you're so shallow, they make it so shallow that anybody could be there, and it doesn't really give you the texture of where you want to be. And so my goal is always to calibrate it so that, I may dump you in there, but I've at least told you that, how deep the water is, or I've given you a life preserver to get you through.
Sure. Yeah, that came across very clearly. It was a nice touch, I thought. Well, while we're on the subject of language, as we always are, one of the inevitable questions that comes up is, do you have any linguistic pet peeves? Because everybody has one. Yes. Here's where we're going to argue, by the way.
Well, so my major one is the inaccurate use of less versus few. They have very different intentions, and it matters. And the corollary is further versus farther.
Okay.
And so those are the two that set my hair on end. And my team knows that these may be things that I push back on.
All right. Those are great peeves to have. We're kind of contractually obligated to not have peeves ourselves, but we recognize.
You can tell me what is it?
I can't. I've had them beaten out of me. I sometimes wish that I could retain peeves, but we always end up, lexicographers tend to default to having our peeves are other people's peeves. The existence of people complaining about decimate tends to be our peeve.
Nicely done.
But yeah, I've spent almost 4 years being the Twitter person for Merriam-Webster. So if there's a complaint about a word, I have heard you out there. I have fielded it, and it has kind of dulled my sensitivity to any kind of peeve that I'm just the most descriptivist person, I think, alive, maybe. I don't know. In Meatballs, the movie Meatballs, when Bill Murray just has the whole rant about how it just doesn't matter. It's something that pops up in my head a lot. But I will say, I feel like the most of the problems that people have with the degradation of whatever word really just comes from a lack of context. And so most of the time, if someone says, I literally died laughing, you're going to know from context that their meaning is figuratively, right?
You do. And that one, but I will say the only other one, and I was dismayed when it was given full truck, but I've learned to deal with it, is impactful. That one has been years of therapy. I still am not quite there, but my hackles don't rise quite as high as they used to.
Yeah. I think the closest I actually do have is nonplussed. Its original meaning was confused, and now it's kind of expanded to mean like not affected, which I think really is because like that is one that's hard to tell from whatever context it's in, because it could be whatever you think it might be.
Yeah, in fact, you used that in this book, and I think you used it twice correctly, or in the manner that we typically think of as correct, is what we say. So.
Thank you, because I am not quite as accepting as you two are, and I appreciate the role you play in the world.
Okay, good to know. No, I mean, we understand. I mean, we applaud passion about language, no matter what. And I think it's delightful that people care enough about language to have hackles raised. And if people didn't, it would be a really sad state of affairs. That being said, we are contractually obligated to look at language as a living, breathing thing, and the nature of language is that it changes. And so our job is to try to record these changes as faithfully as we can, rather than prescribe them. So
there's changes, and then there's asphyxiation.
That's another statistically probable phrase you put. There's changes, and then there's asphyxiation. So you have two so far. That's
okay.
So I know you wrote this book in like 2008, around 2010, in that era. So I have to assume that there were, changes to technology.
Oh, yes.
You had to update. Were there any like linguistic changes that you had to update to say like, oh, actually, that word has completely changed to how it's used?
Only with regards to the technology. So and I made one anachronistic concession, and I refused to do the other one. So her original phone, when she wakes up, when her mother calls her, she had a flip phone. And so it was, there were these moments of conversation where I had to go back and make sure she was using the proper, terminology for the current use of a smartphone. I retained her answering machine, and it should, I've gotten numerous complaints that it should have been voicemail, but I kept it as an answering machine, in part because that was my one nod to the fact that I do still have a landline. I still have an answering machine, and they still sell them. So there you go.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was the language that you gave to Judge Wynn was really kind of very characteristic. And I was wondering, it was a great line: jurisprudence is one of the last pure métiers of Western civilization, like the blues are bid whist. And I felt like that was such indicative of so much of its character. Because, I mean, we all know, I mean, we've often heard of, the only American contributions to art are jazz or blues and spaghetti westerns, but I was unfamiliar with bid whist as one of the things that we've contributed to Western civilization. And it really made me wonder if this was based on a character that you knew, and if because his vocal stylings, his conversation was very, very peculiar. And I mean peculiar in the sense it was indicative of his individual character. And it made me wonder if you are basing either the character or the way he speaks on another person, a real person.
Not exactly on another person, but a composite of people who I could see melding into him. One of the approaches I take when I talk about race in books is that I don't actually ascribe a race to a character, because when I was growing up reading, too often the only characters who were ever mentioned by their race were characters of color. Everyone else was assumed to be white. And so part of my approach has been to add the sort of cultural, the cultural pieces through other means. And Bidwist is, in the Black community, Bidwist and Spades are two games that are just considered, if you can play those games, then you are invited to the cookout, you are a part of community. And so for me, it was, I wanted him to be very much of to be this curmudgeon and to be this man who just was obnoxious, but so cleverly obnoxious that you could get mad, but you wouldn't walk away. Right. And in some ways, he reminded me of my grandfather, who could just be, he was one of the nicest men possible. But, when my grandfather said some things, sometimes it was just so sharp. You're like, I'm glad you love me. So he was never at all like Howard Wynn. But the Bidwist piece for me was important because it was a cultural nod without necessarily having to be overt. If you got it, you got it. And if you didn't, you missed nothing in the story.
That is such a great cultural nod. It's so subtle but so telling. So that was a lovely detail there. Do you have any questions that have come in, Adam, that we want to start adding to the conversation here?
I do have this one comes from Chris. It says, how does your word choice while writing prose differ from your word choice used for political speeches, and how is it the same?
When I started running for office, my sisters, I've got 4 sisters and 2 brothers. And so I have an older sister and one who's a year younger than I am. They noticed that when I got nervous, I didn't speak more quickly. I used bigger words. That was part of my nervous tick. And I say that to say, I love language, and my effort, no matter what I'm writing, is to use the most precise language possible to convey meaning. But whether you're doing prose or a political speech, you've got to create a picture that draws your audience in. And then you've got to give them enough information that they want to stay, but not so much information that they stop hearing you. And so whether I'm writing, Our Time Is Now or giving a political speech, my job is to use language that's accessible, but that's also, it stretches you. And so our spoken word is always a little less erudite than our written word. And that's going to always be the case. But I do tend to also use those sort of linguistic patterns when I speak as I do when I write. My job is to calibrate it, because the way people can hear something is different than the way they can read something. And you've got to make sure that you are never speaking for yourself. You're always speaking so that your audience can learn and understand. And so for me, the responsibility is to always never try to diminish what I'm going to say, because I don't trust my audience, but to always recognize the difference in how people take information in.
Have you done speech writing for other politicians, or do you do?
I have.
And I mean, it's such an interesting question, because we don't speak the way that we write, and we don't speak the way that dialogue in books is written either. And if you were to write authentic dialogue, it would be so full of ums and ers and so's and buts and repeated words. It would just be really, really awkward. So how do you approach this as a speechwriter, particularly if you're writing? Do you take into account somebody else's innate vocabulary when you're writing for them, or?
You have to take into account vocabulary, their pacing. I've written for someone who has a very lyrical way of talking. And so you've got to think about internal, you don't want to do too much alliteration or assonance, but you want to make sure you sort of match the lyricism of their speech. When someone is staccato in how they speak, you've got to make sure you don't give them too many hard words or too many hard consonants to say, because then the staccato becomes this sort of metronome of conversation, and it's terrible. And so I try to think about, how does the person speak in normal conversation versus how do they deliver speeches, because it's rarely the same. And then you want to match the word choice, the length of the sentences, the composition of the speech to how they deliver. So people who love to get it all out in the beginning and then they just meander, you've got to make sure that during their wanderings, you give them just enough. So that's where you'll put a story in the middle. because as they start to wander, you want to bring the audience back into the speech, and a story is a really good way. An anecdote is a good device to do that.
I mean, you sound like you do this with such care and precision that I almost hate to tell you the story I'm about to tell you, but I think you might appreciate it, which is, we're all familiar, our political junkies are familiar with Spiro Agnew and the nattering nabobs of negativism. And, President Nixon's former vice president, somewhat ignominious end to his career, who was renowned for the alliteration in his speeches. And a number of different cases of alliteration. And somebody wrote me one time and pointed out that, and I had a copy of the book and I checked it and it was true, pointed out that there was a Barron's Vocabulary Builder from 1964. And it was a cheap paperback vocabulary book. And it was just a list of words to like improve your vocabulary. And he pointed out that if you looked at the head words at the top of the page, one, it was nabob and nattering. And so somebody was just scrolling through, and it was a whole bunch of these storied alliterations that have become part of our political vocabulary. They were just the guide words at the top of a cheap paperback Barron's Vocabulary Builder. So some lazy ass intern was just sitting like, I got to get some words. I can't even make the book. I'm just going to look at the top, the bold words, and I'm going to put those in the speech. And somehow that took off, and it really like struck gold. So in case you're feeling lazy, I know you can use it cheap.
There you go. I will look for Barron's. I'll find it.
Do we have any other? I know we have lots of other questions, but do you have anything else there rolling in, Adam?
I mean, I just have one from myself that kind of this popped up. That I was constantly struck through this book by how, precise, but also lyrical things, like the descriptions of characters and settings, and even the action itself was just, I could tell from the first page that we were in like good hands, and you were not trying to just move things along, but at the same time it was incredibly effective, and the plot just flies. So I was kind of curious just how you find that balance between like the kind of there are so many flourishes that are really lovely, but at the same time, you can't put the book down, and it still is fast and effective constantly.
Thank you. I think you always have to treat scenery, the physical space, the emotional space, you've got to treat it with the same care you would use for a character. And so I try to create with language the sense of where you are, because once you get comfortable there, you'll be more willing to just accept it and move through the story. And I love, this is one thing I actually took from both romance novels and poetry. Like, lovely language is as much a driver of a good story as anything else. And in romance, part of your mission is to make the characters feel close to you, but also feel real, and that you could be where they are, you could become them, as I said earlier. But at the exact same time, you don't want things to take so long that you start to notice the peeling of the paint, and the moss on the bark is really just kind of ugly. And so you want to give people enough time that they can appreciate it, but not so much time that they start to critique it. And it's a balance. I dumped in a lot of information, and these were complex conceits or complex conversations that had to be held in the story. And so part of the job was to speed where I could, so that when I had to slow down, it didn't feel as slow. But one of my brothers, he actually made me cut a few scenes that I really loved. And one was this amazing car chase, because I love car chases. And he made me get rid of it, because he said it's a great car chase, but it slows the story down. And the fact that a car chase would slow the story down, it was not lost on me. But it made me realize that sometimes you can love the language you use, but it may not be the language necessary for the book. And so part of my job was to go back through and slash where it was beautiful but completely unnecessary, and then add where I was too spare, that the reader might like the speed, but they wouldn't know what they needed to know when we got to this far off chapter. So was trying to strike that balance.
Yeah, I think it created this that kind of it made the death scenes pop that much bigger. Like they're brutal in a lot of ways. And what was that like? Finding like crafting those scenes.
So I've been killing people in books for a very long time, and you've got to calibrate gore with the impact of the death. If I believe in a good body count that's meaningful for the story. So my serial killer romance novel, I made sure there was a really healthy body count. But if it's more a traditional thriller, you want the body count to make sense. Like if this guy is going around killing all of these people, someone's going to notice. So if you've got to have a limited body count, then you need to make every death make sense, and every death should shock and should make you worry about the next person that he encounters. And so that was also part of the goal and you want different kinds of death. And yeah, everybody gets shot all the time. So what can you do to make the death more fun this time? It's very cathartic.
That's such a great approach. It reminds me of there was a book that's not really that often discussed anymore, which was do you remember the you don't have to say that you saw it or not, the Stallone movies First Blood. Right. So they were based on a book called I think it was called First Blood by a writer named David Morrell in the 1970s, and it was a classic thriller, and his pacing and his body count was pegged just right. And I think Stephen King used to say, like, this was the book I used to teach writing plot when I teach classes, because it had such a flow. It was a relentless flow. But yeah, the body count that you had was just the right pace, just the right cadence. So such a great body count.
Thank you.
The question that a lot of people seem to have regarding this book, and I have as well, is do you play chess?
Yes.
Yes.
So I taught myself to play chess when I was in high school by checking out a bunch of books and getting my mom and dad to buy me a chess set. I did not play with anyone else, so I taught my youngest brother, Walter, to play chess. And so I'm not a great chess player, but I know a lot about the history of chess because I learned to play chess by reading history and reading books about famous chess matches. And that's how I learned to play chess.
And so that's where the Lasker Bauer comes from, right? Which was apparently unknown to me, but a very, very famous match, isn't it? Right. You reminded me of we have not that many chess words in our dictionary, but one is, do you know the word patzer?
I do not.
It's a bad chess player. So in case you want to insult somebody with a nice obscure word, you can go with patzer.
Can you spell it for me?
Patzer.
Gotcha.
It's not an old word. It came about in the mid 20th century. I think it comes from the German patzer, same word, which is a bungler. From patzen, meaning to blunder.
It sounded like a German phrase that needed to be used. Yeah.
Right. They seem like the language that would have a word for a bad chess player.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I thought that the chess language rang very true. It was not, it didn't feel like you had gone out and read a bunch of books on chess just to kind of shoehorn this knowledge in. But it also wasn't overloaded with terminology, which was very nice. It was part of the plot. And you have other chess books are there chess books that you've read? Is this part of your chess education, or?
I mean, I still have some books that I picked up when I was younger. And usually it was, these are fairly obscure books on chess history or chess strategy.
Right.
But I've never actually played with many people because when I was growing up, there were no other kids who played chess in my school.
You couldn't get your siblings to play with you that much.
So my younger brother played, and that was about it. And after that, when I was in high school or in college, I wasn't that I liked the game, but I was never so engaged enough that I could join the chess club. And there's a pretty stark reality between being an independently taught chess player and being in the chess club and all of the meaning that travels with it.
Right. So I want to come back to, in terms of, since we're discussing language, is this thing that you've written for speeches for other people. Is there a kind of I assume that there's a feeling of companionship among speech writers, but is there like a speech writer's Bible? Is there a guide to speech writing? Are there works that have influenced it?
Not for me. I stumbled into speech writing. So uh, my very first speech writing, I was a 17-year-old intern on a a campaign. It's a primary campaign. I was hired to be an assistant, and I was typing a paper, basically a speech for the candidate, and it was terrible. And I don't know why this person was allowed to write the speech, but I did not like it, and so I rewrote it. And by to defend myself a little bit, my when my parents were in graduate school, they neither of my parents knew how to type because they were 40 years old. They'd not used word processors, and my dad is dyslexic, so I would type my mother's papers for her classes, but for my dad's papers I would have to read what he was reading in order to give myself some context clues for being able to decipher his handwriting. And I got into the habit of sort of making sure I understood the background so I knew what I was supposed to be extracting from my dad's writing. When I was asked to type this paper, I could not, in good conscience, write some of these things down in the order they were offered. And so when I turned in my independently edited speech, they were very impressed with it. The person who wrote it, to that person's credit, acknowledged that that was not the speech they had written, and I got promoted from assistant to speechwriter.
Uh-huh.
And then I had another friend, someone who was amazing, who I needed a job. I needed to make some money, and she said, "Look, I have to give all these speeches, and you give pretty good." And I'd known her during college, and so she knew I was a pretty effective writer. And so she said, "Why don't I pay you to write me some speeches?" And I'm like, "Okay." And so I developed speech writing by reading her past speeches and then figuring out how to do what I didn't like, what I did like. And then when I've done it for other people, it's usually I listen to or read what they've said before and then try to take the topic they have, match their tendency, but use sort of a marriage of what do I like in speeches, what don't I like, to deliver the speech that they can use.
Hmm. When you do that, do you read it out loud yourself, or is this entirely internal?
It's internal. I can hear their cadence in my head.
Yeah.
And so I will imagine how they will sound reading the speech.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, are you working on another book now?
I am actually. So Avery Keene will have a new book
Okay.
that I'm working on, and I'm in betwixt a couple of other projects. So I'll see which one I'm going to give primacy to, but Avery's got to come first, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Will it have a car chase?
Yes.
It will. I don't know how. I'm not even sure what's going to happen, but this car chase is going to occur.
Good, good.
One of the things as we're reading this book that we do as editors is part of our job as lexicographers is to, as I said before, try to catalog the language and reflect the language as it's used. And so everybody that works at Merriam is basically tasked with collecting sentences that illustrate the use of words. And there were just a number that I've written down that we're going to be entering into our citation files, where you will join a number of other writers from across the world as part of the record of the English language. But most people will not get to see them unless they look them up and it comes up in our dictionary. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of them. The line on page 177, "Such a shame about poor Howard, offered an eggplant-attired matron of impeccable breeding and questionable chromatic theory," which is a lovely, very cutting line there. And the aforementioned, "The kiss stretched beyond time, beyond promise." It's just such a lovely line. "She despised hospitals and waiting rooms, the medicinal scent of death's arrival." And so many of these can be used to illustrate pretty much any word that's in that sentence.
Thank you.
But they there are a number
Such a high compliment, I have to say.
well, they're going into our files, but you should know that they're not going into dust. Well, they are dusty files somewhere
It's okay.
in our basement, but they're also part of the continual record of the English language. And it's because they're words well used. And so we'd like to recognize publicly that you are using these words in an exemplary fashion, and that we're delighted to see them join all other kinds of writing, from Shakespeare to, you know, everything else. No.
If I were capable of giggling, I would be doing it right now.
Okay.
This is awesome.
Okay.
And that was a precise use of the word awesome. This is truly awesome.
Okay. Yeah, you know, that's one of my peeves. My peeve is when people don't like to use don't like awesome when it spreads. That's I can make that a peeve. Because the reason is that everybody likes to say, oh, kids, they always say everything is awesome, everything is awesome. You know what they always say? They say that's awful. Why is it that awful can change and mean anything we want it to mean? The dinner you made last night was awful. My foot smells awful. Your feet smell awful. Whatever. Awful can be used in all these different ways, yet somehow we think that awesome should have this kind of sacrosanct, this sacred meaning. So that's my peeve.
Well, there you go. I win.
Okay.
Got you to admit a peeve. Excellent.
So Mary wants to know, do you have any favorite words?
Syzygy is one of my favorite words ever. When I learned that there was a word that was spelled with only Y as a vowel, so it's Syzygy. I also love Star Trek. If you know me, I love sci-fi, Star Trek, Star Wars, less so. Star Trek is really my thing. Yes. And so the alignment of celestial bodies and just all of the different iterations on that theme. So yes, syzygy is one of my favorite words.
Fantastic word.
Good choice.
And Lawrence wants to know, who are your favorite writers? Fiction, biography, political commentary?
I will give an array of writers because I do not pick favorites because they change. And there are some I will go back to. Nora Roberts will always be one of the premier romance novelists because she has mastered the art of genre fiction in just exceptional ways, both her traditional romance as well as her writing as J.D. Robb, which is sort of criminal, romantic thriller. She meshes genres there. Robert Caro is the preeminent biographer for me, although I do adore books by, I like Doris Kearns Goodwin. I think everything David Halberstam has written, and Taylor Branch. So I think they're really solid writers who tell extraordinary stories that are real and true. In science fiction, N.K. Jemisin has become a writer I really love to read. And in this sort of floating world of science fiction, science-ish, Rebecca Roanhorse has been really, really fun to read. And then, you know, traditional writers, the canon writers, Charles Dickens cannot be beaten. That's someone who really appreciated language. Yes, because he was paid by the word, but he made certain that everyone he used made sense.
But that is a great array of writers you have there.
So go out and check out their books.
All right.
Actually, Bobby wants to know, can you talk about your writing process? Are you a scheduled writer, or do you write when inspiration strikes?
I love writing, but when I am writing to a major project, I wrote my first book, Rules of Engagement, on spec. So I wrote it, sent it out in the world, they bought it. After that, I was on a contract for every other book I wrote. And I was also practicing law or starting a business, or I was in the legislature. So I've always had to make sure I wrote while I was doing other things. So I'm not a wake up at 6 a.m. and write. I'm more a, let me find how many days it's going to take me to write this book. And then I carve out that number of days and that number of hours to get it done. I do a synopsis for myself. So usually I'll write a scene so I know where I'm going and who my main characters are. I then do a story. I do a synopsis, then I do a storyboard, and then I plot out the book chapter to chapter. And once that's done, I just have to get it written because either they want a book or they want their money back. And usually the money is gone. And so the book has to manifest itself.
That's a good process. I like that. Do you write only on computer? Do you write on pad? Do you write on typewriter? Do you have a?
I initially wrote primarily, I would write by hand to do the synopsis, and I will usually do my storyboard, the initial storyboard, on note cards so I write it out. I type most of the dialogue. I type most of the stories, and I used a desktop until I think I wrote While Justice Sleeps on a desktop. So I think I used a laptop for the first time to write a book when I wrote Lead from the Outside. So it wasn't until I started writing nonfiction that I moved to a laptop. But I've now gotten used to it.
When you're reading a book, do you write in the margins, or is that?
No.
Oh, okay.
My mother was a librarian.
Oh, that's right.
I do not write in books.
Right. That would be sacrilege.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, there was a little bit of a heart palpitation when you asked, going like, no.
Right. Yeah, you look shocked by that. Like I asked if you burn your books after you finish reading them or something.
Yeah. And the answer is no, just in case it hangs out there's a question. No.
Well, thank you again. I mean, thank you for the book, and thank you for coming on, but really thank you for the book. And it was, as expected, just a sheer delight to talk to you and to read the book. And so we look forward to many more. And that's it.
Love to have you back.
Quite a wonderful experience. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the wordsmith out there and word lovers.